We're told it's another startling shift in policy. President Obama just returned from India, promising groundbreaking new deals on nuclear cooperation. But what does that mean for us? And what does it mean for India? Well, Arabic news outlet Al Jazeera reports critics have expressed concern after U.S. President Barack Obama announced a breakthrough agreement with India on civilian nuclear cooperation, saying little is known about the deal, and it's unclear whether compensation will be paid to any victims of any nuclear disaster. Meanwhile, Daniel Roderick, president and CEO of Toshiba-backed Westinghouse, calls the deal a breakthrough. Now, our guest today said on Monday that this agreement basically shields U.S. corporations from liabilities due to negligence and provides nuclear accident victims with little to no chance for compensation. So it appears once again corporations win and the individual loses. To find out more, we turn to nuclear policy specialist Mr. Robert Alvarez. He served as a senior policy advisor to the Secretary for National Security and the Environment, the DOE. He's got a lot of experience in this field. Mr. Alvarez, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the deal, I understand you worked very closely with a nuclear strategy for North Korea in the 90s. You spent a lot of your life trying to scale down tensions and move towards disarming nuclear weapons. Does this new deal with India help to accomplish that goal?
Well, this new deal, as it's portrayed in the news media, doesn't really affect the pace and scope of the Indian nuclear weapons program, which is quite extensive and has been going on for many years right now. In a way, it frees up India to use much more of its uranium resources for its nuclear weapons program.
Now, you've probably heard the U.S. Institute says they have satellite imagery to suggest North Korea could be activating their nuclear reactors once again. What do you know about this report? Is it credible? If so, what does it mean?
Well, if we're talking about North Korea, I was mistaken. I thought we were talking about India at this time. Previous question. We're talking about North Korea. I mean, I have no doubt that they are busy trying to reactivate their reactor to make more plutonium, and that this is very consistent with their behavior and how things have sort of fallen apart since the United States had an agreement with North Korea in 1994.
Now, shifting back to the new deal with India, specifically to how this might impact the strained relationship along the India-Pakistan border, critics of the new deal fear that this might actually cause new frictions between the two rival countries. Is it possible for the U.S. to be friends with two countries who are at odds with each other?
Well, that's what's going on right now. I mean, the United States has had a long historical, let's say, quote, friendly relationship with Pakistan and a not so friendly relationship with India, especially during the Cold War, where India insisted on neutrality and often was a trading partner with the former Soviet Union. This dynamic is changing a lot, mainly because of the end of the Cold War, the emergence of China and India as potentially booming global economies. So the United States, as part of their shift in focus in terms of global policy towards the Far East, sees India as an essential element of this new policy.
Now, as I stated, Al Jazeera has noted it is unclear if victims would be compensated if there was a nuclear disaster. Yet you made that very declarative statement on Monday that this agreement actually will shield corporations from liability. Explain.
Well, that's the idea here is an idea that's been made into law in the United States in the 1950s. It's known as the Price-Anderson Act. And at that time, in the 1950s, when the United States was basically encouraging utilities to build nuclear power plants, they could not get insurance because the damages from an accident involving major land contamination and exposure to large numbers of people to radiation was so great that they couldn't get any insurance. So the United States passed a law called the Price-Anderson Act, and it set a limit on liability. so that companies could go forward and get financing to build nuclear power plants. And if a major catastrophic accident happened, then they would only have to pay for a certain limit. At that time, it was $540 million. It's now somewhere in excess of $10 billion. And at that point, either the government would have to step in and compensate victims, or the victims would be left out in the cold. I mean, if you were to look at your homeowner insurance policy right now, you would see that that policy does not cover your home for nuclear accidents. And that's because of this federal law. So what has happened is that India is pushing and is seeking to establish a similar liability cap, which the United States agrees on. So that's really what that's about.
Now I want to get deeper into that, because looking now at a study from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, their report stated that estimated that a major accident involving a spent nuclear fuel pool fire in the United States would impact 9,400 square miles with a long-term displacement of 4 million persons. Now, given that the probability of such accidents is really considered low, and private insurance refuses to cover nuclear power plants, so who would then be liable in that potential scenario? You mentioned homeowners insurance because, well, what about folks? They choose to live near the plant, the corporation running the plant, or local, state, or federal agencies that are to oversee the operations.
Well, the way that I understand the deal is structured with India is that there is a cap of $122 million on the liability of companies that build, design, and operate nuclear power plants in India. Once that limit is exceeded, then it's anybody's guess as to what will happen, because it falls upon the Indian government to provide a solution. Now, if you look at what happened in Bhopal in 1986, we still have a large number of victims who've never been compensated.
Well, who should be the liable party once that cap is exceeded?
Well, obviously, the companies that were responsible for the negligence should be primarily responsible for this.
Now, what about the government?
But the catch-22 is that U.S. companies won't do business in India unless they are shielded from liabilities.
Well, what about the regulatory agencies? Let's talk about U.S. for a second. What about U.S. regulatory agencies that are supposed to oversee and make sure that these facilities are safe? Is there any liability that falls there?
No, not really, but you raise an interesting issue with respect to the regulatory agencies. India does not have anywhere near the capacity to regulate the safety of nuclear power plants as the United States has, or Japan for that matter, which experienced a catastrophic accident, as you know, in March of 2011. India right now has about nearly 3% of its electricity is met by nuclear power plants, and these are mostly of a small nature, not the size and capacity as you would find in the United States or Japan or in other countries, Russia, for example, or France. So India would like to triple that amount of electricity generated, and are trying to purchase newer, more complicated, and much larger capacity reactors from the Russians, from the French, from the U.S., and from the Japanese. Actually, the U.S. doesn't sell reactors anymore because they've been purchased mostly by the Japanese. So India is trying to pursue a very ambitious agenda of nuclear growth. And so this liability agreement will not only extend to U.S. Businesses, but also to all the other businesses that are knocking on India's door to build nuclear power plants.
Now, we always hear about connections between nuclear programs and the environment. Of course, Fukushima is one of the last great disasters that we can point to. But I just mentioned that some of these threats really are minimal and may not really ever happen. So what kind of true threat do these nuclear plants pose to the environment?
Well, you know, this is something that they pose potential catastrophic risks to large numbers of people. and that the problem is the escape of radioactivity in the environment in large quantities, which can cause displacement of millions of people and increase the risk of people contracting diseases associated with radiation. But it's mainly the land contamination problem that is probably the most severe aspect of this. The problem with nuclear power is that indeed the probabilities are low, but we've had experiences now with major reactor accidents, 3 core melts in Japan with a country that has very highly industrialized, advanced economy, and that even despite that, they experienced a significant catastrophic accident. Their entire nuclear fleet, which is the third largest in the world, is effectively shut down. And there are still tens of thousands of people who've been evicted from their home with no idea when or if they'll ever return. So it's a risk that you have to take to do this. And so what we're finding out is that unless you have, what we found out with Japan is that there was too cozy a relationship between the government regulator and the builders and operators of the reactors. You have precisely that relationship going on in India.
Well, let's talk about this now. The Reuters report went after Westinghouse Electric, and this quote says that we are learning they might build a new plant in India. Is this deal more about safety or business?
It's about business, and it's about upping the stock of companies on the markets. And so, and unless you have an ability to sell in the market, you have nobody who wants to buy your stocks. It really boils down to that very simple notion. The problem with India's ambitious nuclear power growth is that they already have a fairly, what we would consider minimal nuclear safety culture and regime, where they have an inherent conflict of interest between the promoting entity of government and the regulatory entity. They are one of the same. We broke up that relationship over 40 years ago in the United States and created a separate regulatory body. So when you start to scale up and start to build these very complex, basically one-of-a-kind machines, it becomes very, very important how you hang a pipe, how you weld a pipe, what the chemistry inside the reactor is, and you require a much larger, more attentive and skilled nuclear safety oversight and infrastructure to make sure that things don't go wrong. If you are talking about a threefold growth in nuclear energy for India, this is going to put an enormous strain on their already insufficient safety infrastructure. If you take a look just briefly at India's safety record, while they've not had catastrophic accidents, they've certainly had an inordinate number of leaks, shutdowns, and a significant number of worker overexposures.
All right, well, we're going to certainly watch and see how this plays out. Thanks for joining us, Robert.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that was Robert Alvarez from the Institute for Policy Studies. You can find out more about him at i-ps-dc.org. Up next, we've got today's special reports, and Amanda Gabriel is standing by with your daily digital report.